Despite the tenacity of a hard-fought series of grueling battles in which the SS Police Division particularly distinguished itself, the Stalin Line was finally broken in late August, and Army Group North surged onwards. On the Baltic front, von Leeb's Army Group North had captured the city of Novgorod, a vital target in the approach to Leningrad. The beleaguered defenders of Novoguch had fought to the death, but this resistance too had been in vain. The Germans had discovered the city's defensive plans on the corpse of a Soviet officer. With the Stalin Line broken, General Herpner's 4th Panzer Group resumed its drive toward Leningrad, but without supporting infantry, its progress was limited. Leningrad was a vital center of the wartime production industry, and reserves and equipment were poured into the defense of the city. As the Germans approached, the citizens now formed into militia, divisions of which were flung against the Germans more in despair than hope. Following a basic training period averaging 16 hours, the 1st Militia Divisions were sent to the front only 6 days after being formed. The 2nd Division marched to the front only 2 days after its establishment, and the 3rd, the same day it was established. Nonetheless, some Russian civilians obviously felt caught between two fires. One senior Soviet officer later summed up the choices available. He declared, "We were faced with a choice between two dictators, Hitler on the one hand and Stalin on the other. But we preferred to pick the one who spoke Russian." An ominous development for the Germans at this point was the appearance on the battlefield of the Russian medium T-34 tank and the heavy KV-1. Both of these machines were clearly superior to the German tanks and were all but impervious to most German anti-tank weapons, especially the puny 37mm anti-tank gun, which was then the main German anti-tank weapon. The 37mm was so ineffective against Soviet armor that it was nicknamed the door knocker by the disgruntled German anti-tank gunners. These puny 37mm guns were intended to deal with some of the best armor in the world. General Erhard Raus, who fought with Army Group North, left a clear account of the first encounter with the new Russian armor in the shape of the trusty KV-1 tanks which attacked the 3rd Panzer Division. Then there suddenly appeared for the first time a battalion of heavy enemy tanks of previously unknown type. The tanks overran the armoured infantry regiment and broke through into the artillery position. The projectiles of all defence weapons bounced off the thick enemy armour. 100 German tanks were unable to check the 20 Russian dreadnoughts and suffered losses. Several Czech-built tanks, which had bogged down in the grain fields because of mechanical trouble, were flattened by the enemy monsters. The same fate befell a 150mm medium howitzer battery, which kept on firing until the last minute. Despite the fact that it scored numerous direct hits from as close a range as 200 yards, its heavy shells were unable to put even a single rank out of action. The situation became critical. Only the 88mm flak finally knocked out a few of the Russian KV-1s, and forced the others to withdraw into the woods. The only bright sign for the Wehrmacht was that the new Russian tanks were still in relatively short supply, and their battle drill was poor. Once the scattered formations had been dealt with, the road to Leningrad lay open again. Despite the limitations of some of its weaponry, by September, Army Group North had destroyed, for all practical purposes, the Soviet Northwest Front. It had virtually eliminated 2 Russian armies, driven to the outskirts of Leningrad. The collapse of the Northwestern Front was a real catastrophe for the Red Army and brought Stalin to the brink of despair. Leningrad's fate hung by a thread at the beginning of September. But Stalin was to make one inspired move. He appointed Marshal Zhukov to the command of Leningrad, and this remarkable soldier was to prove himself equal to the task. As Army Group North drove headlong towards Leningrad, a further huge haul of confused Russian prisoners was taken in the Baltic states, and a large body of Russian troops was isolated in what became known as the Oranienbaum Pocket on the Baltic coast to the west of Leningrad. The Oranienbaum Pocket was a small semicircle of Russian-held territory, an area of ground that was never to be taken by Army Group North, despite all attempts over the next 3 years, and it was to prove a tactical thorn in the side of the 18th Army. When the 18th Army and Panzer Group 4 burst into the Leningrad area in September 1941, they swept forward at high speed, and as they moved swiftly north, they either destroyed or brushed aside the Soviet armies. One tiny element of the Soviet 8th Army, which had suffered catastrophically from the attack, was pushed right up to the coast. There, around the town of Oranienbaum, 3 elements of the 8th Army kept up resistance for virtually 3 years. The bridgehead acquired enormous strategic significance. The Oranienbaum area enabled the Russians to protect the island of Kronstadt. This island was vital to the naval base directly to the west of Leningrad. It enabled the Soviet forces in the region, both naval and military, to prevent the German forces of Army Group North completely denying Leningrad the resources which enabled it to survive the subsequent siege of Leningrad. On September the 4th, 1941, Senior Lieutenant Darius of the 1st Panzer Regiment radioed back to headquarters that his unit had reached Leningrad. Other units from the 18th Army pressed on to capture Schüsselburg to the east of Leningrad. With the arrival of the rest of the 18th Army to reinforce the panzers on the 8th of September, the German stranglehold on the city of Leningrad tightened further. The capture of Schüsselburg to the east signaled the end of rail transport. The German invaders surged on as far as Tikhvin, deep inside the Russian hinterland. Despite the best efforts of the population,